Thank you, everyone. My name is Carlos Sandoval, and I come from Mexico, from the state of Veracruz. And I have been in Canada for a while now, for more than 20 years. I've been coming and back and forth from Mexico and Vancouver. Right now, I'm living and working in the territory of the Kwantlen, the Musqueam, the Semiahmoo, the Katzie, Tsuwatsan, and Coquitlam peoples. And I'm very grateful for that, as I am an uninvited guest, and I feel the responsibility, towards contributing towards the decolonization of these territories. And today I'm going to be sharing some of the work that I've been doing in Mexico, where I come from. I'm going to be talking about the Nahuatl language. I divided this presentation in 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk about general overview of the indigenous peoples of Mexico. Then I'll talk a little bit about what the Nahuatl language is, where it is, who speaks it, and so on. And then a little bit about the language loss. And finally, I'll talk about the efforts towards revitalization of the Nahuatl language. So I'm going to try to be quick, because I don't think we have enough time for all the things that I wanted to talk about today. But let's start. So first of all, this is Mexico. I'm showing you the map of Mexico. There's about 126 million people living today in Mexico, out of which 23 million people identify as indigenous people. Now, these are self-identified people, indigenous peoples. The official numbers are, different because of the various ways in which the concept of indigenous is defined in Mexico. If you look at the census, you will find that indigenousness is defined by whether you speak an indigenous language or not. And so if we take that, there are 11.8 million people who live in households where an indigenous language is spoken. And then if we only take those who actually speak the language, we have 7 million people in Mexico who speak an indigenous language. Now, what I'm going to be sharing with you is the particular case of Mexico, and particularly of the Nahuatl language. And the contexts are different in different locations. In Mexico, indigenousness is not usually conceptualized in terms of biology or blood. It's conceptualized in various different ways. An important one is whether you belong to an indigenous culture, an indigenous territory, if you speak the language. So that's why these numbers are important. Now, I want to show you where the indigenous peoples of Mexico live here. What I'm showing you are just the locations that have a majority of indigenous population. So these are not individuals, these are locations with a majority of indigenous population. And there are 68 different indigenous languages in Mexico. You can see the map. It'll give you an idea of where the indigenous peoples of Mexico are. Now, the Nahuatl language is spoken by about 1.6 million people. So you see there's a lot of people who speak this language. It's the second most spoken language after Spanish in Mexico. Now, we do also have some indigenous languages which have a very small population, like Ahuacateco. There are only 20 people who speak that language, Kikapu, 63 people. So the contexts are different, the struggles are different, the strategies are different. So what I'm sharing today is going to be focused more on the Nahuatl, the case of the Nahuatl. So this is the map of the Nahuatl communities. What you see here in red are, the communities where Nahuatl is spoken by the majority of the population. Now, the Nahuatl language, it was the language spoken by the Aztecs. So probably some of you are familiar with the Aztecs, which is what's been popularized in the collective imagination. Many will say that the Aztecs were defeated by the Spanish and so on, but we still have 1 million, almost 2 million people who speak this language. Now, the Nahuatl language, it's actually a language that is closely related to the indigenous languages of northern the northern part of America. The Nahuatl language came from the north. It's part of the Uto-Aztecan language family, and it is said to have originated in the American states of Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming. So this language is actually closely related to the Shoshone language, the Comanche language, the northern, southern Paiute, and Hopi languages. So these are part of the same linguistic family. And these are also some of the other indigenous languages of Mexico that are part of the Uto-Aztecan language family. Now, um, this this presence of the Nahuatl language in this region of Mexico extended all the way to Central America. In El Salvador today, there is also a community of indigenous people who speak Pipil, which is also a Uto-Aztecan language. Now, this history of migration is actually very present in the collective memory of indigenous people, of the Nahuatl indigenous peoples. The stories say that the Nahuatl came from a place called Aztlan, specifically from a place called Chicomostoc. Chicomostoc means the seven caves, and the stories of origin of the Nahuatl people tell that seven different tribes came from different caves, and then they migrated down south, and then they populated all of these regions of Mexico. Of course, then they became dominant from the 12th century until the 16th century when the Spanish arrived in Mexico. The Nahuatl language was the lingua franca, that is to say, the common language that was used all throughout this territory to communicate, even between people who spoke different languages. Now, as I said, there are 1.6 million people who speak this language. Now, Nahuatl, of course, has different variants, different dialects. There are more than 30 variants, but we can actually organize them in some groups that I'm showing you here. I'm not going to spend that much time. Just I wanted to show you, where the Nahuatl speakers are in Mexico. And I'm going to focus on Veracruz because I am from the state of Veracruz, and this is where I've been working. So in the state of Veracruz, it's right in the Gulf of Mexico, there are three different pockets, if you can see here, of Nahuatl speaking territories. These are different variants, the Huastecan in the north, the central Nahuatl, and then the southern Nahuatl. Myself, I was born in this region here, in the southern region, and my mother's family and my ancestors from my mother's family are buried in this region. So I come from both the central Veracruz and southern Veracruz region, but I've been working mostly in the Songolica region. Now, the Songolica region, here I'm showing you some pictures. This is what it looks like. It's the only region of Veracruz that is mountainous. Everything else is tropical, has beaches, but this is the mountainous region of Veracruz. That's where the Nahuatl speakers are concentrated in central Veracruz. Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran is a Mexican. He was a Mexican anthropologist, very famous anthropologist. He called these the regions of refuge. What that means is that after colonization, many indigenous peoples were able to keep their language, keep their traditions, keep their culture, because they took refuge in these types of regions, which are hard to access. They are in a place separated from the other more accessible regions. That's why he calls them the regions of refuge. And even to this day, you see a lot of the cultural practices are practiced by the living communities of these regions. What I'm showing you here is just an example of some of the rituals. This is called the Xochitlalis, which means the offering that the community gives to the earth. There's a hole that is dug in the earth, and then food is given to the earth. And then here you have an example of some of the textiles that are still done in this region of Veracruz. Now, all of this to say that the Nahuatl culture is very much alive, is strong today. There are a lot of people who speak this language. And one thing that I want to say is that within the language itself, we can see the world of knowledge that is embedded in the language, the worldview of the Nahuatl people. We can see that in the language. For example, I'm just going to give you some really quick examples. So the word for indigenous we use is masewale. Masewale means those who deserve. So if I want to say I'm indigenous, I say ni masewal, which means I am a masewal. Why is it the literal translation is those who deserve? Well, it comes from the myth of creation. It means those who deserve the sacrifice of Quetzalcoatl, because the stories say that the masewal, the indigenous people, the people were created by Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl, here you can see is the feather serpent, and the story says that Quetzalcoatl wanted to go into the underworld because he knew that the lord of the underworld, which is depicted here, Mictlanteuctli, he had the bones of humanity hidden in the underworld. So he wanted to steal the bones in order to create humanity. And so he tried to go into the underworld, but it's dark and it's difficult to access. So he had to turn himself, Quetzalcoatl had to turn himself into a dog. So he became Xolotl, the dog. Now the dog, of course, can smell his way around, and so he went all the way to the underworld and stole the bones of humanity, and then he came out, and then Quetzalcoatl, he made sacrifice, so he bled himself, and with his own blood, he was able to create people, to create humanity, to create indigenous peoples. Now, even today, the Nahuatl believe that if you mistreat a dog, when you die, the dog will not lead you towards Mictlan, towards the underworld. So even today, the belief is that Xolotl it is still guiding the souls of the deceased into the underworld. Now, again, it's just an example of how there is so much meaning charged into the language. Another example that I wanted to give you, the word movement. In Nahuatl, we say olin. Olin means movement, and this is the symbol for movement. Now, of course, if you go back to this depiction that I was showing you here, you see the symbol of movement because that represents life. Now, the word life that we use is yoli. Yoli, you can see that it's derived from olin. So movement is actually life. It's the exact same word. The word for heart, we say yolot, and again, you see the all, this word stem here, all, is repeated because movement is what's at the center. And if in order to have life, you have to have movement. If it's not moving, then it's not alive, right? And corn, for example, the word corn, for the center of the corn, we say olot in Espanol. In Spanish, we say olote. And again, you see the same word. Why? Because corn is so basic for the life of and the sustainability of the Nahuatl indigenous peoples of Mexico. So you see, all of this is embedded in the language. One more example that I give you, the word that we use in Nahuatl for one, simply se. When we want to say 1, 2, 3, you say se, ome, e. So the word one is se, but it's also used to conjugate verbs in the first person plural. So let me give you some examples. If I want to say one person speaks, I could say something like se tlapoa. That means one speaks. But if I want to say we speak, I say it exactly the same, se tlapoa, because it gives you the idea that when one speaks, we all speak. The idea of unity, it's also the idea of totality. And it's just the very basic way in which we conjugate the verbs, any verb. Like I'm just giving you another example. One eats, it's exactly the same as saying we eat. So if one does it, everybody does it. One walks, we walk. Sorry, here I repeated se, but it should just be senehnemi, which means we all walk, right? Another example in Nahuatl, if I want to say I want something, the word for that would be nikneki. That means I want it. But it's the exact same word for I need it. In fact, in Nahuatl, we make no difference between wanting something and needing something because it makes no sense from this cultural perspective, from this linguistic framework, it makes no sense to separate something that you want from something that you need. If you want it, it's because you need it. If you need it, it's because you want it, right? One more example, the concept of chikawalistli could mean strength, could mean energy, could mean good health, it could mean maturity. So when we try to translate Nahuatl to Spanish or to English, we often find that it's difficult because the concepts are different, the ways of seeing are different. Yol Chikawalisli. Now, if I take this Yol, you guys remember, movement, life, heart, and I add Chikawalisli, that just means strength of heart, which is understood as courage. And a very common concept among the Nahuatl speakers is the concept of Masewal Yol Chikawalisli. Now, you can see it's an agglutinative language. So what I'm saying here is something like indigenous resilience. If I wanted to come up with this idea of indigenous resilience, I would probably say something like Mase Walyol Chikawalisli, which is giving you, the idea of strength, that moves from the heart, but it's within the world of the Masewal indigenous. So again, this is just an example of how we must not forget that languages are not just a means that we use to communicate, but rather languages shape our thoughts, our culture, our identity, our worldviews. Language is a symbolic system through which culture is codified. So we think differently in each culture. When I think in Nahuatl, I think differently than when I think in Spanish or English. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Sapir-Whorf thesis, you'll remember this idea that every language creates a distinct world. Here's a quote from Sapir. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. So it's not just that we name things differently, but the thing that we name remains the same, but rather the world that we are naming is differently depending on which language we're using. We see and hear and otherwise experience very largely as we do because the language habits of our community predispose certain choices of interpretations. Now, if you follow, then the question is, what happens when a language has no more speakers? So when a language dies, a whole way of existing in the world as a human being dies. This, of course, when I was thinking about this, reminded me of a poem by Miguel León Portilla. Miguel León Portilla, he's very well-known scholar of the Nahuatl culture in Mexico. He wrote this poem. Ixcuactlahtoli yemiki, mochitlamantlin semanahuac, tehuatl, atoyatl, yolcame, cuauhtini huanxihuitl, ayok monemilo, ayok motenualo, tlachialistica huancaquilistica, ayok monemi. Which means when a language dies, everything that there is in the world, the sea, the rivers, the animals, forests, jungles, are no longer thought. They're no longer pronounced. They're no longer seen nor heard. They no longer exist. So one way of existing, one world of existence dies when a language dies. That takes me to the third part. What's happening now with the Nahuatl language in Mexico? I was saying earlier that the Nahuatl language is strong. There are almost 2 million people who speak it within the region that I'm, talking to you about, the Songolica region. The children speak the language. Everybody, not just the elderly, the adults, everybody speaks the language, is well and alive. But I should also say that this is almost an illusion. When we look at what's happening, we realize that the trend is towards the disappearance of the language. If you remember the numbers that I gave you earlier, 6% of the population speak an indigenous language. This is in 2020. 6% today, 6% of the population speak an indigenous language. But if we think about how did we come to this point in which only 6% of the population speak the language, then we realize that something's going on. Now, the story, the very simplified story that we learn when we grow up in Mexico is that the Spanish came and then they conquered, and for 300 years we were colonized by the Spanish, but then in 1810 there was an independence war that was fought. The Spanish were expelled, And of course, the Mexicans now decolonized. That's the story that we tell. But then when we look at the numbers, we realize that at the moment of independence, 60% of the population were indigenous. Just before independence, 60% of the population were indigenous. You see, what happened during the independent period is that indigenous peoples were subjected, to a constant genocidal and ethnocidal campaign. In other words, they were forced into becoming mestizo. I'll explain that in a second. There was a campaign that was launched during the independent period of Mexico to get rid of the indigenous populations of Mexico, and you can see that in the numbers here. So we went in the 19th century from 60% indigenous people to 29% only in 1921, right? Then if you look at the 20th century, you realize that the trend continued from 29% in 1921 to 6% in 2020. So there's a trend here. Now, how do we make sense of this? The one concept that I use to try to make sense of this is the concept of coloniality that has been theorized by Quijano, Millol, Walsh. They will argue that even after formal colonization has happened, there are still deeply embedded patterns of domination, exploitation that persist and evolve after formal colonization. So they're, of course, referring to political, economic, social patterns of domination, but also cultural and epistemological patterns of domination, which is what has characterized the construction of independent Mexico in the last 2 centuries. And the independent Mexico was imagined and constructed within the paradigm of Western modernity. What does that mean? It means that when the Spanish were expelled from Mexico, it was not the indigenous people who liberated themselves, and then all of a sudden, they were decolonized and they could go on with their life as it was before colonization, but rather those who were at the top of the hierarchical structure during the independence of Mexico, they imagined Mexico to be a Western nation. What that meant is that everything that was indigenous was seen as backward. Now, Mexico was constructed within this colonial paradigm in which we organize everything. And when I say everything, I mean, knowledge, I mean, culture, politics, laws, art, everything falls within this paradigm. It's a paradigm that's characterized by the idea of civilized versus uncivilized. And this in Mexico was reproduced in terms of the dichotomy of mestizo versus Indian. Indian was thought to be backward. Mestizo was thought to be modern. And of course, this became a problem because indigenousness was accepted in Mexico as long as it was something in the past. In fact, it was glorified. Indigenous peoples of the past are still glorified. We see all of these murals, and you go to Mexico City, and they're depicting the greatness of the Aztecs and of the Mayans, and we talk about it. But the indigenous peoples of the present, they're deemed to be a problem. Of course, the indigenous peoples of the present are deemed to be backward. Now, this means that everything that's associated with indigenous cultures, knowledges, languages, ways of thinking, are seen as obstacles to modernity, obstacles to inclusion. This was what was called in Mexico the indigenous problem, a very famous person in Mexico. He was a politician, a philosopher. He was a governed person, a statesperson, Jose Vasconcelos. He actually created the modern education system of Mexico. He designed the modern school system in Mexico. He thought that Mexicans should be considered mestizos, and that's it. Indigenousness could not fit into this concept of being mestizo. Now, you have to remember that it's not about blood, because if you think about who are Mexicans today, most of Mexican people have indigenous blood. But if we go back to this history, Jose Vasconcelos thought that the indigenous way of life should stop existing. in order to create a modern mestizo Mexican society. And this is a quote from Jose Vasconcelos. He said that the goal of the education system was to bring the Indian into civilization, that is to say, into Christianity and Hispanicity. So what this did is that during the 20th century, governments came up with all of these policies that were meant to help, that's how they framed it, help indigenous peoples stop being indigenous, to Hispanicize, and we use the word castellanizar, to make indigenous peoples forget their language, forget their culture, and speak Spanish. Now here I want to show you, how that happened. Right? This is the 20th century. You can see here the percentage of the population of Mexico who speaks who speak an indigenous language. Now, in 1934, the Department of Indigenous Education and Culture was created. 1940, that's when the first Indigenista Congreso in Pátzcuaro happened. 1948, that's when the National Indigenous Institute was created. 1963, the bilingual education system was created. 1978, that's when the contemporary indigenous education system was created. We still have that today. I'm adding here 1994, important dates, the Zapatista uprising, 2003. That's when the law of language rights was passed in Mexico, and just recently with the López Obrador government, the Instituto Nacional de los Pueblos Indígenas was created. Now you see all of these policies, but then when you cross these dates with the graph that I'm showing you here, you see that systematically, after each one of these, the number of indigenous speakers fell, and the trend just keeps going down. If you look at the numbers today, it just keeps going down. So what does this mean? Does this mean that public policy failed? Well, the problem is that this public policy was designed within a colonial framework. You see, even today, many of the politicians, the governors, the people who make the decisions today, you see that there is this, how do I say this, a triumphalist discourse. And they will embrace the idea of indigenousness. They will embrace, the idea of indigenous languages. They showcase it. But when you see the result of the policies, the effect is the contrary. The effect is actually the decrease in indigenous speakers. Now, of course, what I mean when I say that public policy has been designed within a colonial framework is what I was saying earlier. This idea that we can divide the world into the civilized and the uncivilized. I believe that lies at the center of the paradigm that we have created this from which we have created these public policies. Now, this framework divides the subject versus the object. Now, the subject, of course, is deemed to be the mestizo, those who speak Spanish, English, French. And of course, the indigenous is the object. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look around in Mexico, indigenousness, indigenous culture, indigenous language is always the object of study. But it's studied by the mestizos. It's studied in Spanish. It's studied in English. You can read books in English. You can read entire, grammar about Nahuatl, but it's written in French even, because indigenous languages are always the object of study. Now, you see a lot of efforts towards language documentation because there is this assumption that indigenous languages are predestined to disappear. So we have to document them because they're just going to disappear, of course. Where is this paradigm coming from? Where it's coming from the gaze of the mestizo, of the Western gaze. Of course, you see a lot of linguists and anthropologists will flood indigenous territories to try to study the language, to try to study the culture, assuming that these cultures are unchanged. If, for example, some of these anthropologists, that go into study the Nahuatl language and Nahuatl territory, see that the communities are adopting modern practices, then that will immediately be deemed to be unauthentic, right? Indigenous languages are considered to be an object of scientific curiosity even, there's there's this perspective that sees the indigenous as the exotic, as the strange. Indigenous peoples in Mexico are the objects of public policy. They're seen as the poor, they're seen as populations at risk, described as culturally, economically bereft, as an obstacle to inclusion. So all of these are examples of the types of discourses that stem from the public policy. And again, the paradigm, the premise here is that indigenousness is the object of study. Um, it's an object of cultural consumption. Many people today, many mestizo populations are now very interested in, asserting their historical roots. They're proud of, wearing the traditional huipil, and now they're proud of being Aztec, Maya. But again, when confronted by the real living indigenous, then that is seen as an obstacle, right? Um, Now, indigenous languages are seen as stuck in the past. What do I mean by that? So there's this trend that says that indigenous languages are only useful to tell stories. They're only useful for tradition. But if you want to do science, if you want to do real literature, if you actually want to talk about modern domains of discourse, then you have to leave your indigenous language and use Spanish, English, or French. The assumption here is that indigenous languages are stuck in the past. And if you want to talk about modern things, then you have to use English or modern language. Anyway, so this, what I'm showing here is this, colonial framework, that lies, at the center of all of this public policy towards indigenous peoples in Mexico. Indigenous peoples are spoken about. We reflect about indigenous peoples, we write about indigenous, we read about indigenous, we teach about indigenous peoples, but we never hear indigenous voices. Now, here I'm showing you some pictures of some of the indigenous schools. We do have a specific indigenous school system in Mexico that targets indigenous communities, that was created in 1978. But here, the way that this is promoted is that in these indigenous schools, Nahuatl is going to be used in the classrooms, right? Because all of these are Nahuatl speaking children. However, this is only at the elementary level, because the assumption is that if the Nahuatl children go into high school, then they will of course have to leave the Nahuatl behind, because if you actually want to progress, if you actually want to educate yourself, you have to leave your indigenous language behind. That is the assumption. Now, what is happening is that the government tells all of the indigenous teachers that they should use the Nahuatl language in the classroom, but indigenous teachers, Nahuatl teachers, do not have the materials that they could use to teach the children in the Nahuatl using the language. They also do not have the lexicon. If you tell a teacher, an indigenous, a Nahuatl speaker, to teach Nahuatl children about math, about biology, about history, using Nahuatl, well, sure, they may have all the desire to do so, but they themselves learn those curricula in Spanish, so they lack the vocabulary to be able to do that. We see, for example, if you go into the Nahuatl territory, the Sierra de Songolica, that all of the media around are in Spanish. So imagine that you are a Nahuatl speaker. You are Nahuatl children growing up in Nahuatl territory, and then you turn on the radio, because in that region, the radio is still very much used. So you turn on to the radio, and then you get into one station, and it's Spanish, and then you change in Spanish, and then change in Spanish. And the only thing that you can hear, it's in Spanish, even if you are in indigenous territory. You cannot find books in Nahuatl. If you are going into high school and you want to read about your Nahuatl history, you actually have to do it in Spanish, not in Nahuatl. If you, I don't know, if you want to learn about your grammar, the Nahuatl grammar, you have to do so in Spanish, not in Nahuatl. Now, think about the impact this has in the in the child who's growing up in this context. What is this telling the child? That the child is growing up, and seeing that if you actually want to progress, if you want to be educated, you have to do so in Spanish. So that, convinces the children that Nahuatl is not worthy. And we see this again and again. I've seen campaigns, of government officials who go into the communities talking about, how indigenous communities should continue speaking Nahuatl. But this contradicts the reality, because we see that there is still a widespread, discrimination, stigmatization of indigenous peoples. To speak an indigenous language in the eyes of the indigenous communities means to be indigenous, of course, and it also means to be poor. It means to be a social problem, right? This is the framework that has been constructed in Mexico. Now, I've seen a lot of efforts, government efforts and, private efforts, towards revitalization. But again, they're framed in this idea that, indigenous people don't know better. So you see all of these government officers go and, even reprimand indigenous communities because they don't want to speak their language. There's a reason why indigenous communities are choosing to leave their language. Many Nahuatl-speaking mothers are choosing to speak in Spanish to their children so that they don't speak Nahuatl, so that when they grow up, they're not discriminated. And yet you have all of these government officials saying, hey, you know what, you have to speak Nahuatl. Sure, but if my child grows up speaking Nahuatl, he's not going to be able to be an engineer or to study a profession. If he wants to do that, he actually has to leave leave Nahuatl and speak Spanish. So that takes me, to the last part, language revitalization. I'm rushing because I'm looking at the time. So a couple of things that some Nahuatl organic, intellectuals and activists and language keepers, have started coming together, in previous decades, and starting to realize that any effort towards language revitalization must place indigenous voices at the center. You remember these indigenista policies that I was talking about earlier? They were done by non-indigenous. These were policies made by non-indigenous for indigenous peoples. Well, now, of course, we realize that any policy must come from the indigenous voices, right? But it also must do away with this subject-object dichotomy that was inherited by colonialism. See if I can tell you what I mean by that. It must acknowledge indigenous languages and cultures as living processes. Living processes means that the Nahuatl are not stuck in the 16th century. The Nahuatl speaking people today, they read, they write, they study, they work in all of these different professions, and they do not want to stop being Nahuatl in order to be professionals, right? Now remember this this symbol, this symbol that I showed you earlier, the symbol of movement. If we do not see languages, indigenous languages and cultures as constantly evolving, adapting to new contexts and to new situations, if we want to see indigenous languages and cultures as static, stuck in the past, then of course we're condemning them, to their demise, right? 5 more minutes, perhaps, and we'll have some discussion. So sometimes we think that language is only used to transmit information, to transfer information, but that's not the case. Roman Jacobson tells us that there are 6 different functions of language. We use language to communicate emotions, feelings. We use language to establish contact with other speakers, to try to initiate conversation. We also use language to speak about language itself. When we're talking about something and I ask you, what do you mean by that? Or what does this word mean? So we use language to speak about language. That's the metalingual function. We write books about grammar. So when I studied Spanish in school, I studied Spanish grammar in Spanish, and here in Canada, we study English grammar in English. Okay? So the poetic function, we also use language to convey an aesthetic sense, literature, songs, poetry. Referential function, to interpret and conceptualize the world. And also we use language to influence others' behavior. So if we take this this 6 functions, then it gives us an idea of the vitality, the real vitality of the Nahuatl language. So what is happening now in the territory? The motive function, of course, that we can see that the Nahuatl is still fulfilling that function. Nahuatl is used in the communities, in the household, the grandmothers and grandparents use it to speak to their families. But when we come out of the household, then we realize that Spanish becomes the language, even within the Nahuatl territory. When one person from one community of Nahuatl speakers approaches another person from a different Nahuatl community, they speak in Spanish to each other because they do not necessarily want to reveal that they're Nahuatl speakers because of all of this context of social discrimination, as I was mentioning earlier. Metalingual function is also, fulfilled by Spanish. If I want to take Nahuatl lessons in Mexico, I do so in Spanish. Spanish is the language that is used in the classroom to learn Nahuatl. If I want to read about Nahuatl, I will read in Spanish. If I want to understand, how the grammar of Nahuatl works, I have to do so in Spanish. I cannot find a book written in Nahuatl for Nahuatl speakers about Nahuatl grammar. So the metalingual function is not present as as of today in terms of the vitality of the Nahuatl. Poetic function. There are some Nahuatl poems, Nahuatl literature that you can find in the territories. But when we want to use language to interpret and conceptualize the world, what we are finding is that the older generations are no longer transmitting, the indigenous knowledges to the younger generations, and then the younger generations are just sent to school where they are taught that if they want to do science, it must be in Spanish or English. If they want to do research, it must be in Spanish or English. And finally, the sixth function will realize that even within the Nahuatl territory, public policies, laws, regulation, government services, everything that's offered to the Nahuatl speakers is done in Spanish. So of course, when we see this, then we see the real picture. And Nahuatl is being displaced by Spanish. Now, what have we been doing here? We've worked into the creation of a grad school program. It's a master's program. The master program, this is the first of its kind. It's a program that is offered 100% in Nahuatl. So this is a grad school program where everything that's done in the classroom, everything that's written, that's read in the classroom is done in the Nahuatl language. The thesis, the dissertations are done in Nahuatl. This program is targeting the indigenous teachers. So the idea is that they acquire the resources that they need in order for them to teach the children using their language. We've promoted interdialectal dialogues. So this idea that if you speak one variant of Nahuatl, then you cannot speak to another a different variant of Nahuatl was promoted by linguists and anthropologists, non-Nahuatl linguists and anthropologists, who were more interested, in publishing books about dialectology than rather promoting, communication between the Nahuatl communities. We've also promoted the publication of, books in Nahuatl. Here's just, an example of these are monolingual books in Nahuatl that are only written in Nahuatl, not in Spanish, not in English, not bilingually, because we found that when we published, a book bilingual, Nahuatl, and then its translation in Spanish, then, everybody would read the Spanish. Even the Nahuatl speakers would read the Spanish because it was easier for them because they were trained in Spanish. They were not trained in, Nahuatl writing. So that's why now we are promoting, and the publication of texts in Nahuatl. We've used modern digital platforms, where we encourage, people to use monolingual conversations in Nahuatl. The idea is to treat the language, the Nahuatl language, as a living language, as a modern language, because the Nahuatl are not stuck in the past. The Nahuatl are, modern people in modern contexts who want to use their language, their knowledge, their worldview within existing contexts. Now, I'm just going to leave it like, okay, last one thing that we also trying to do is to visualize, to make the language visible. So one way we did that is, to promote this poetic action in Nahuatl in the territory so that the people see their language. Because before you could just walk around the territory, the Nahuatl territory, and everything's in Spanish. You would not see the Nahuatl language. So now the idea is to make it visible, to make people proud, to make ourselves proud of our language and our culture. Anyway, so I'm going to leave it at that, hopefully, so that we can have some dialogue, because I believe I taken more time than I should have.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. It was amazing to hear all that great work, and thank you very much for sharing this very important research. I'm sure there's a lot of conversation that people would like to join. I see we have a question in the chat from Amir. How does the idea of whiteness frame language policies in Mexico? How does whiteness frame being Mexican, and how is it the idea of mestizo constructed and objectified through the discourse of whiteness?
Yes, thank you for that question. So as I was saying earlier, so these discussions about race and ethnicity in Mexico are not necessarily about blood. Being indigenous, it has little to do with blood. However, the concept of whiteness, it has been very present. In fact, the promise of the independent Mexico was that indigenous people could become white. Because you see, we all look the same, right? But the idea is that if you stop speaking the indigenous language, if you leave your backward culture and if you embrace this modern Spanish-speaking mestizo culture, then you could become white. That's how the concept of whiteness, was framed. It was a promise. You can stop being backward, and then you can become white. Which is also why you see that there's been a lot of efforts towards eliminating indigenous languages in order to eliminate indigenous cultures and peoples. I don't know
if... Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have any other questions. I have a few questions myself, Carlos, if I may. I was wondering about, and I know you talked a little bit about the how this language is being passed on intergenerationally and the younger generations. And I was specifically interested to hear what are your feel on the takes and the relationship of the younger generation with the Nahuatl language, and how do they, how are they perceiving it personally, other than, rather than how it's offered to them, but how is it being received by them?
Thank you very, very much for that question, because there is indeed some tensions between older generations and younger generations. I've seen, for example, that many of the younger generations, many of the university students, who speak Nahuatl, when they use the Nahuatl language at home, they're reprimanded because they're told, no, that's not the proper way to speak it, right? No, you should not use it this way. So what that ends up doing is that they decide not to use it, and they just resort to Spanish, right? Which is also why what we have tried to do is create spaces in which we can use the now, just, however you want to speak it. Like, for example, a very common verb now that people use is escanearos. If I want to say, I'm going to scan a document, how do I say that in Nahuatl? So people who want to be pure speakers of Nahuatl, they will just use Spanish in order not to contaminate Nahuatl. But that's causing a shift, the language shift. You're leaving your language. So instead of that, many of the younger generation, they just decided not really to care about this purist ideas, and they'll just say something like "Nitla escanearos, one se ama." I see some of the other questions in the chat is related, but one of the questions that says is, what form of writing system did the Nahuatl language use before the alphabet? That's also a very interesting discussion, because from this dichotomy that I was saying earlier, the subject, the object, and it's assumed that indigenous languages are the object of study, they're in the past, right? They're unchanged, but it's also assumed that they can only exist in tradition, they can only be oral languages. If you want to write in Nahuatl, if you want to do, academic work in Nahuatl, many will say, well, no, you cannot possibly do that because that you would be contaminating Nahuatl, right? However, in the context of the Nahuatl language and the Nahuatl culture, it's important to acknowledge that the Nahuatl language has been written since the 13th century or even before, right? Before the Spanish came, it was written. I showed you some codexes there, examples of, how language was written. It was an evolving system of writing that was based on, ideographs, right? Like logograms, that represented not necessarily sounds, but ideas. When the Spanish came in the 16th century, the Nahuatl scholars immediately took the Latin characters and used it to write. And so they wrote Nahuatl. I have like books here, from the 16th century, 17th century that are written in Nahuatl using Latin characters, but without a normalized grammar or orthography. Now, just in the past 20 years, there has been a lot of discussion among different Nahuatl communities. And recently we've kind of come closer to a consensus as to how to write the Nahuatl. It's important to say that this does not mean that everybody should speak the same type of Nahuatl. We're not saying Nahuatl should be standardized, but we're saying we should have some common ground as to how to write it so that I can read the Nahuatl speakers from different communities.
Mhm.
That addresses the question. And I don't know if we have time, the last question that I see here, how the ideals of
One more minute to go, yes.
how the ideals of Americanization as a source of knowledge and education for elites since the 1970s related to the push towards westernization and rejection of indigenization. You see, I do not see this as something that started in the 1970s, because the same thing started happening, as I said, since independence. It was not necessarily Americanization, but it was the promise of entering modernity, which means you have to stop being backward. You'll embrace Spanish, right? All throughout the 20th century, that was the idea. The Nahuatl parents did not want to teach their kids Nahuatl because that would condemn them to backwardness. I'm sorry. I think it's 2 p.m. and if I'm
Yes, we got to the end of it. It's a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure there was a lot of discussions that could come afterwards. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time of the session, but I really thank you very much for starting the conversation and getting these, our thoughts provoked with a lot of these great ideas. Carlos, thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you very
everyone
much.
for attending.
Let's come at the mic.